Hello and welcome to the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation's Critical Incident Stress Management live series, where we discuss a variety of crisis intervention topics. My name is Kelly and I'll be the host for today's discussion. If you've enjoyed today's discussion, let us know in the comments down below if you'd like to see similar crisis intervention topics throughout this year. Today, we're joined by guest speaker, Michelle Lilly, who will discuss avoidance and the importance of peer support. Welcome, Michelle.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So can you provide our viewers with a little bit of your background and experience with regard to this topic?
Yes, absolutely. So just as a bit of background, I'm a professor of clinical psychology at Northern Illinois University. I've been there since 2009. And in that capacity, in addition to training clinical psychologists in evidence-based treatments for trauma, including first responders, I've done quite a bit of research on the topic of PTSD, depression, anxiety, and physical health problems in predominantly 911 telecommunicators, but also more recently with law enforcement. I'm also a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of Illinois. And I also have APIT licensure to practice across some state boundaries. So I also have a part-time clinical practice called 911 Recovers, which offers evidence-based trauma-focused treatment for first responders and their families. And then in addition, I do some consulting work. So sometimes public safety agencies, when they're struggling, I go in and try to help them figure out what the problem is. Predominantly when they're struggling with things like leadership issues or interpersonal issues, or they just have folks who are having a hard time sometimes just getting along, and go in and do training and sometimes engage people in difficult conversations. And then finally, I have a grant through the state of Illinois to do 2-day trainings for law enforcement called Saving Blue Lives. And the focus is on learning about PTSD, depression, risk for suicide, resilience mindset, and peer support. So that's kind of the varied roles that I've been playing in this space for a while.
Sounds like you stay quite busy.
Very busy. I'm a very busy person. Yeah.
Well, today we are going to be focusing on the role of avoidance and the importance of peer support. So because the title of this discussion starts with avoidance, tell me a little bit about what you mean by avoidance.
Yeah, that's a great question. So avoidance is, I kind of liken it to white knuckling, right? So many of us have experiences in our lives that are distressing or upsetting. And as human beings, we don't really enjoy feeling distress, or we don't like feeling anxious. So one way that people start to try to cope with those kind of more uncomfortable feelings is by trying to either deny that they exist or suppress their emotional reactions. And that all kind of falls into this broad label of avoidance coping. And avoidance coping is kind of a problem because what we know about our brains is that when we don't allow ourselves to naturally process distressing events, we kind of tend to get these like error messages in our brain because our brain likes nice, clear, coherent stories that have kind of a beginning, a middle, and an end. And when we engage in avoidance, we're not allowing for kind of that natural process of making meaning of events and then making it become part of it, of kind of our autobiographical narrative, right? So when we avoid and we engage in this kind of suppression, denial, kind of pretending that things aren't bothering you, it can have real ramifications for our mental health down the road.
So avoidance in general can mean a variety of things. It's not just one particular thing or another. That can look very differently depending on the individual. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. So there's kind of a broad kind of category of avoidance coping. Some people are very good at just denying it, right? So I've worked with quite a few people in public safety who said, for years, I just didn't think that I was even experiencing any distress, right? Because they were so good at just kind of denying and suppressing. Avoidance can also look very behavioral. So if, for example, you take a law enforcement officer who's handled a call in a particular area of town, if they no longer want to be assigned to that district, or they're engaged, kind of having a hard time engaging with, for example, other law enforcement officers who are there at that time, that can be a signal that somebody might be engaging in avoidance coping.
Okay. So you kind of touched upon that avoidance is a problem, but can you really expand upon
Mhm.
why it's a problem specifically with regard to crisis responders?
Yes, absolutely. So it makes perfect sense why first responders, why crisis responders engage in avoidant coping, right? So like if I call 911, I would rather that person not be crying, right? Or be emotionally distressed by what I'm saying, right? I want them to be very good at suppressing their emotional reactions. And so, it's the same for law enforcement, other crisis responders, where, you become quite adept at avoidant coping because you have to successfully perform. But avoidant coping when you're off the job can be a problem because when you're experiencing these distressing events, as I mentioned earlier, and you're not allowing yourself that natural process of kind of making meaning and recovering, it actually prolongs symptomatology. So in the context of PTSD, which is where I'm also often talking about this, avoidance is a real problem because in fact, counterintuitively, it increases risk for like things like intrusive thoughts, nightmares, flashbacks, because essentially what you're doing is you're saying, don't think about it, don't think about it, don't think about it. But when you're telling yourself actively, don't think about something, it's bringing that thing online in your brain. So then all of a sudden, when you're distracted or you're trying to relax, your brain's like, haha, now is the time that you need to think about and make sense of this thing that has happened for you. And we also know from the cognitive psychology literature that the more that people try to avoid and suppress a thought, the more that there is a rebound effect. So I kind of liken this to like a beach ball. Like if you have a little beach ball and you try to push it under the water and you lose your grip on it, it might come back and kind of splash up. But if you have this big thing that you're really avoiding and trying to push down, and then you lose your grip, it's going to come back and smack you in your face, right? So we don't know exactly why that is, but the more that people try to suppress thoughts, the more actually they have an increase in those thoughts when they're no longer actively able to suppress.
Oh, wow. So why do you think we see a lot of avoidance coping in first responders then?
Yeah, well, because it makes sense, right? If I've been in an accident and I'm having crisis responders show up, I'd rather they not be crying, right? I'd rather they not be having a strong emotional reaction to what they're seeing. So
Well, we
wearing
want
these kind
somebody
of
that has a calm head, right? We don't,
yes,
because if they're freaking out, then it's just going to kind of allow us to freak out even more, especially when a
absolutely.
crisis is occurring.
Yeah, absolutely. I want them to be suppressing any emotions that they have in that moment, right? If they're distressed, if they're grossed out or disgusted or frustrated, I don't want those emotions as somebody who needs help for it to get in the way of their successful performance. And to successfully perform in these fields, you have to be able to manage those strong negative emotions, because otherwise you just wouldn't be good at your job. And you might fail to do the things that you really want to do, which is do things like save lives and help people. So avoidance coping just becomes kind of very natural, but it becomes more of a problem when it becomes kind of the only way that people are coping with distressing events in their life.
Well, and just from what I'm thinking about, I mean, if you're a crisis responder and you're on call, or working out in the field for extended periods of time, I can totally see how it would be very difficult to shut that off, especially when you go home and you're no
Absolutely.
longer in the field or working actively.
Yes. And what I see in crisis responders a lot is that when they go home, they either just don't want to talk about it, or because they're tired and they want to move on with their day. But there's also this strong feeling that, and in some cases it might be true, that the family is not going to want to hear about this horrifying event that you have witnessed, that you've seen, that you've managed, dealing with perpetrators or other types of things when you have kids in the home. Like you don't want to come home and be like, guess what I saw today, right? And so it can carry over either intentionally because you are actively trying to not let your family know what's happening, or also just kind of unintentionally because sometimes you want to end your day and go about your life and not think about it anymore. So it can really bleed into your family functioning.
Hmm. So then how does peer support factor into this discussion of avoidance?
Yeah, well, peer support, I truly believe that peer support is, and the kind of formulation of peer support programming, training people in peer support might really be a lifeline for crisis responders, because I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. And what I know very much is that there's still so much stigma around seeing a mental health clinician. And I get so many people who reach out to me after struggling for many, many years with whatever it is that they're struggling with. And sometimes by that point, it's gotten pretty bad. And then even then, sometimes there's a hesitation or difficulty with staying committed to being in therapy. And I totally get why, right? It's a time commitment, resource commitment. Going to therapy is not fun, right? Like going and then not avoiding, right? When you mostly avoid, is not really high on people's, vision board, right? That's not something they really want to be doing. And there is a kind of true, I believe, lack of culturally competent therapists out there who really understand the jobs of being a crisis responder. So I've had people come to me and say things like, oh, my former therapist just said, well, why don't you just quit your job? She's like, well, and I had explained, like, I actually love my job, right? And I want to be able to do my job. I've had other clients say things like, I was telling them about an incident that I handled and they started crying, right? It's like not helpful when your clinician starts to cry, right? So kind of the lack of culturally competent therapists out there, I think also is a barrier to people seeking more formal assistance. So in that context, I think peer support is so powerful, because if we can train people how to be supportive of their peers, what we're really doing is kind of normalizing that. I hate this phrase, but it's okay to not be okay. Normalizing that struggling and the aftermath of these things is actually kind of just a normal human reaction. And to say, yeah, I've had that type of call, or I've gone to that type of scene and I was really bothered by it, can really help destigmatize and normalize people's experiences. Mm-hmm. And it can help people engage in more approach behavior. So if we think of like avoidance as people like, white knuckling and I don't want to talk about it, approach is when people are willing to kind of talk about it, sit with it. And we know that approaching the behavior or approaching these memories or distressing events is really important, because it helps people just process the event in a way that then our brain kind of timestamps and catalogs it. So I think especially right now, the crisis responding field is so understaffed, so overworked, that finding time to even go to a therapist is a lot. But if you're riding around in your patrol car with another law enforcement officer, another crisis responder, you have those opportunities, brief and in the moment, to say, yeah, that was really hard for me. So I think peer support really could be a very long-standing lifeline and really transform the crisis responding industry.
That's awesome. So what has your research shown regarding peer support then?
Yeah. So there's a kind of a dearth of information. There's so many projects all the time in crisis responding. Like people will be like, oh, I just filled out this survey, this survey. So you'd think that there's more information on peer support, but there's really not that much out there. So about 2 years ago, me and Jim Marshall with the 911 Training Institute and Pam Apoka with the Mid-America Regency Council devised a project where we wanted to look at this to start in 911 telecommunicators. And so we enrolled about 250 911 telecommunicators from across the country, and we asked a lot of questions about their mental health, job-related factors like job satisfaction, turnover intention, organizational compassion. And then we asked a number of questions about, does your organization have a formal peer support program? Do you use it? Broadly speaking, do you feel like there's a high level of organizational support? And then we follow them over time. And at baseline, and I'll just be brutally honest with you, because as I mentioned earlier, I'm busy. So I have not sat down and looked at the longitudinal data, but at baseline, what we found is people who said just on a 5-item measure that their agency has higher levels of organizational support had lower risk for PTSD, depression, anxiety, stress, lower job turnover and tension, higher job satisfaction, and just overall greater well-being. So it's tremendously important. We also find that simply having a formal peer support program has salutary benefits, mental health benefits. So individuals in organizations that have a formal peer support program tend to have better mental health, higher job satisfaction, lower turnover and tension, even though those people aren't using it much yet. So what we found is that people are reporting that they don't use it much. But I think that's because we're so early in this process that it takes time for people to feel comfortable to open up, right? And to trust it and to truly believe that it's going to be confidential. Because if you go and tell a peer something, how you're feeling, and then it gets out and you're betrayed, that is a really, really difficult emotion and can engender really high levels of psychopathology.
Well, and it kind of stays with people too at times. And, if that happens, multiple times throughout their career or even within the span of a shorter time frame, that can cause devastating effects.
Absolutely. And really what you're doing is discouraging people from engaging in those approach behaviors, right? Mm-hmm. So you're kind of encouraged, if people have a negative disclosure experience, you're encouraging them to not approach again, right? Or if you go to your peer and you say something that's happened and they have a negative reaction, like if they get upset or they start crying or they personalize it, or they say things like, ooh, is your chief going to put you on leave, or are you going to get written up? People are like, oh gosh, right? And you can just even see, like in my body right now, people start moving backwards, right? Not engaging in approach behaviors, but start to actually avoid.
So then what would you say to the family members of first responders regarding avoidance? Because I know they bring it home, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's really, it's a really challenging question, because people say to me all the time, things like, sorry, you can see my dog getting comfy in the back here. So people ask me all the time, like, should we talk about stuff or should we not talk about stuff that happens at work, right? And what I will say is that for families, each family, it kind of depends, right? For some people, it's like the same as trauma. People say, oh, this person went through this experience. Do you think it's going to affect them? I'm like, I don't know, right? Trauma is experienced differently for everybody. And the outcomes are very personalized based on your life experience, what you've got going on, lots of different factors, right? So it's similar for families, right? There might be some families and some couples, for example, where it's really helpful and healthy for them to sit down, maybe not every single day, after every single shift, but say, you know what, I experienced these things this week. It was really rough, right? That might be really beneficial to some families, right? And it might really encourage the crisis responder to open up more, to engage more, and can really help, right? However, in some families I've seen, I've had crisis responders who either, for example, are married to other crisis responders, and they come home and it's like, all they talk about is work and things that they've seen. That can lead to a really high level of kind of perseveration and thinking about it a lot and talking about it a lot. And what we know is that people need time away from these jobs to rejuvenate, right? To kind of repair. It is such a stressful and challenging job. You need that time and space away from work. But if you feel like you're always bringing work home with you and always talking about it, you don't get that space. So I think crisis responding families just need to navigate that. They need to probably have some intentional conversations about, do you want to hear about this? How is it beneficial? How do we kind of talk about these things in the home without it taking over, right? And so, there might be a preference for some people. I was just talking to one of my clients the other day, and he says he gets home and his wife's like, what happened? And he said, I just don't want to talk about it. It's not necessarily avoidance. It's like, I want this to be my safe space, right? Where I don't have to think about these things. This is part of my recoveries, coming home, right? And showering and being done with that, right? For other people, it might be helpful. So it really is so individualized and based on many factors. So I think just having intentional conversations early on, especially about how to navigate this, can be really helpful.
So then are you seeing more avoidance in crisis responders during the pandemic? Because we're now almost 2 years into it. from
Yeah.
what you're seeing, you know.
Thanks for reminding me, Kelly.
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
Are you seeing more of that though? Like with some of the clients that you're seeing?
I would say that between the pandemic, and I work with a lot of law enforcement, so that's who you'll hear me reference a lot. So between that and the civil unrest that happened, started in 2020, I'm definitely seeing a lot more avoidance. And I think partly it's because they're now becoming more and more understaffed. So in the summer of 2020, for example, New York Police Department saw a 411% increase in retirement filings. And because of COVID, academies were shut down. So there's nobody kind of in the hoppers coming up, and complicated by the fact that a lot of people don't want to be in law enforcement anymore, or other 911 industry or other crisis responding industries, like even 911's having a really hard time because people are seeing kind of an understaffed industry where they're going to have to work all the time. They going to have to probably work shift work schedules and not work holidays. And that tends to not really be on the vision board of millennials. And so getting kind of the younger kind of generations of folks into these crisis responding industry is proving to be a real challenge. So yes, I certainly think between COVID, I think COVID has, resulted in, because again, these crisis responders, it's not like I was home, right? I was home with children every day, right? So it radically transformed my life in that way. But for crisis responders, their life didn't change in that they're still going to work, but they're going to work where they're having to worry about this virus that was starting, especially at the start, showing to be proving to be very scary, right?
Mm-hmm.
And interacting with people who might not be wearing masks, or apprehending people who aren't wearing masks, and then wearing your own masks. And so I think there has been kind of this, just keep your head down and keep moving, because what else do you do, right? What else do you do in the middle of crisis? And I would say very much so for a lot of crisis responding populations, the last 2 years has been crisis.
Mm-hmm.
So that's often how people cope in those moments.
So I think we've done a pretty good job of covering the overall definition of what avoidance is, how it applies to, crisis responders, and then also why peer support is so important. So my next question is, what are some tips for crisis responders in dealing with avoidance? Because I think, leaving on a high note would be probably a good thing.
I know, I'm so doom and gloom. So I go and do these, 2-day trainings called Saving Blue Lives. And I just tell people from the start, I'm like, I'm not popular at parties, right? Because like people say like, oh, what are you doing? I'm like, oh, I study people like who have been traumatized. And they're like, oh, great. And it's not an entirely uplifting topic. So I appreciate your audience continuing to listen to this, despite the lack of upliftingness.
On a higher note, it's an important topic, I think, that crisis responders and others should hear about and should talk about. So, although it may be a doom and gloom topic, there is a lot of relevance, especially now, with regard to why it does need to be talked about, and kind of, like you said, end the stigma and just kind of open that conversation for a lot of people.
Absolutely. Yeah, I will give you tips in a second, but yeah, I have seen a huge transformation in the industry in just my time in the last decade, because the first couple kind of trainings or conferences or other things that I went to, and I would start talking about PTSD, people would literally sit in their seats. A lot of people, not everybody, and they would just glare at me. And I was like, oh, geez, I guess I'm not supposed to really be talking about this, right? Or people don't want to talk to this. That's very short-sighted, because if we don't start talking about these things, and the industry continues to be understaffed and underfunded and under-resourced, we're really in a scary position, right? So in terms of your actual original question about re-engaging, it's really about talking, right? And I'm a psychologist, so everyone's like, oh, of course it's about talking, but it is, right? So we know that when people who are struggling with a particular event or series of events, when they sit down and they actually just start verbalizing their experience, it is very helpful. And sometimes that first time that they start talking about it, say with a peer supporter or former clinician, it's hard, right? There's oftentimes very strong emotions. But what people learn is that they can talk about it without falling apart. They can talk about these things and they'll be okay. A memory is not a threat, right? It's just a memory. It might be a sad memory, but it's not a current threat. And that's what happens in PTSD is this memory becomes kind of couched in the brain as a current threat, right?
Mhm.
Because it hasn't been kind of processed and cataloged. So just getting people to talk. And what I would also say is sometimes it's about talking about the trauma or the critical incident, which is helpful. But when we're seeing people who are becoming really avoidant and really withdrawn broadly, just
Mhm.
getting them to talk words is helpful. So you don't have to go in heavy and be like, how are you feeling? Or I know this happened to you, tell me about it. You can just say like, hey, did you catch the Cubs game? Right? Or the White Sox. I gotta represent both, right? Because I'm not a homer. Like White Sox, like which game did you get? Are you a fan, right? What'd you do this weekend? Right? What have you kids been up to? Just getting people to speak words out of their mouth lights up areas of their brain that become underactive when they're depressed. So when we can get people to just start talking, even if it's not necessarily about the incident or things that they're experiencing, it's helpful. And the other thing that I would say is, if you're in the position of wanting to help somebody re-engage, don't ask them questions like, how have you been? Fine, right? That's like a very normal cultural exchange. How are you? I'm fine, right? What's been going on? Nothing, right? You got to ask these nice open-ended questions. And if you yourself are having a hard time re-engaging, again, just start reaching out, start talking. There's a way in which crisis responders kind of, I think, sometimes naturally become very isolated because, you might have entered this field with a gazillion friends, but over time, those friends might not work shift work schedules, or they have weekends off and you have Mondays and Wednesdays, Tuesdays, and not even every week, and so there can be this natural process in which crisis responders start kind of losing those friendships outside of the field. And those friendships and those relationships are critically important because they help people maintain balance and perspective. And so I think kind of being very proactive about maintaining those relationships or re-engaging them is also really important.
Well, those are all wonderful tips. Thank you.
Great.
I know I personally enjoy it, but I think all of our viewers will as well, because it is a relevant yet heavy topic, but we do want to give people takeaways from our discussion today that maybe they can put into practice each and every day, even if they start small.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
and starting small is key, just really quickly, because what we see is if people are really depressed, right? Say somebody's really depressed and they're laying on the couch, right? And they're having a hard time getting up. And then you say to them something like, hey, you should go to the gym every day. And they're like, oh, I have no reason why I can't go to the gym every day because otherwise I'm just laying on the couch. Well, they're not going to, they're depleted, right? They're exhausted, right? Even if they're not doing anything, right? The depression is exhausting for that person. Right. So if you're kind of at a place of true depletion or isolation, you've got to set really small goals to get back to doing things that you naturally enjoy and engaging in things that are naturally rewarding. So somebody who's on a couch, you don't say, hey, go work out every day. It's like, you know what? Every couple of days you set one small goal. This goal today is to get in the car and drive around and figure out which gym you want to join. Right. And then you really take small steps because otherwise, people are likely to not be able to complete the task, and then they feel more like a failure, right? So sometimes just really small steps is the way to go.
Sure. I mean, I would even say even just doing menial daily tasks,
Absolutely.
just doing laundry or
yeah. I love doing laundry, but yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, for everyone, they have to
to
find their own way, and what works for them and their families, of course.
Absolutely.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for all of that.
You're
That's
welcome.
very helpful. Well, I do want to thank Michelle for joining us today to discuss avoidance and the importance of peer support. Now, if you've enjoyed our discussion today and would like to learn more resources about avoidance, Michelle has put together a helpful PDF for you to download. This PDF is free to download and share with your coworkers and peers. We're hoping to continue to offer individuals free resources during these live interviews throughout 2022. This is something new that we're hoping to offer to you guys in the future. If you guys enjoy all of these helpful resources, let us know down in the comments, and we will continue to improve this program. As we start another year, the ICISF team is working diligently to continue to provide quality education and training courses. We offer courses through our live training program, which provides the traditional in-person classroom training using Zoom technology. We also offer online courses where you can learn critical incident stress management at your own pace. Have you taken CISM courses and just need a refresher? Our refresher programs work on competence with a specific intervention through scenario-based training exercises. And if you're looking for group or even agency training, you can learn more about our Speakers Bureau program. To see all of our current courses and training programs and plan your 2022 CISM training, you can visit our website at ICISF.org. I'll link each program in the description below. The ICISF courses that would be helpful to learn more about the topic discussed today are our core courses, including assisting individuals in crisis, group crisis intervention, and a specialty course entitled Resilience Training, Psychological Survival Skills for Before, During, and After a Crisis. We'll link the course descriptions below as well. For Michelle's organization, we'll actually link all of her contact information if you would like to reach out to her with any questions, as well as her website. So that way you guys can reference that as well. If you're looking for additional critical incident stress resources offered through the ICISF, you can get them all on our website, the Crisis Journal, the ICISF app, and even on social media. We'll share the links for all of these resources in the description below. We have articles, PDFs, videos, and a variety of other resources available to you through these different platforms. And again, if you've enjoyed today's discussion, be sure to give this video a thumbs up or even leave a comment down below in the description. We're wishing all of you a wonderful new year. We are excited to continue this CISM Live series. And until the next discussion, remain safe and healthy. Thank you all.